Hi, I'm Barbara Lucas, and welcome to the Green Room, where we explore the environmental topics that green up our world. Today's topic is birding. People have always hunted birds, whether for food or for sport, but tracking and observing birds without killing them is a relatively new concept. In the past 50 to 100 years, birding has grown from a rather esoteric hobby pursued by few to an exciting sport enjoyed by people of all backgrounds and ages. Joining me is Sarah Toner, a 15-year-old who will be sharing with us her experience as a young birder. Sarah, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Barbara.
So to get started, why is it that we're using the term birding and not bird watching?
Well, bird watching is a term that we typically use for less serious people who get out and enjoy birds. So maybe they go out and see a robin in their backyard, but a birder is someone who actively seeks out birds.
Okay, that helps. And I read a survey that said that birding is the #1 fastest growing recreational outdoor sport, and especially amongst your age group, 15 to 24. And I also noticed that there's a new movie coming out this winter called A Birder's Guide to Everything, and it's about a 15-year-old that's pursuing a rare bird. And so I just mentioned that because it kind of goes to show that birding for youth is becoming mainstream. Mm-hmm. And so what do you think are some of the benefits for birding for young people?
Well, it gets you outdoors a lot, because today's youth are getting so sucked into video games and TV and the internet, but birding gets you outside. You're enjoying the nature and you're learning a ton about birds and the world around you.
Mm-hmm. And how about the social aspects?
You definitely network with a lot of other people. You learn how to talk with adults, how to talk with other people your age, and you really network with people across the country.
Which reminds me, I've been going on birding walks this past year, and you've been the leader of most all of them, sort of unofficially, because you happen to know more about the birds, mm-hmm. which I've been very impressed by, because these people on the walks are 4 or 5 times your age, and your self-confidence, I mean, it must help your self-esteem a lot to know so much about a subject.
It definitely does, especially when I can help someone identify a species that they didn't know before, when I can share my knowledge.
Mm-hmm. Which is a trait about birders that I've really enjoyed, the fact that they're so interested in helping you. I mean, a new birder just feels so welcome, and people really want to give you information.
There's no point in hiding whatever you know.
Yeah. And you mentioned that people around the world are networking. Do you use social network on the internet to? Yes,
there are quite a few Facebook groups for whether you're looking around in your state, whether you're across the US or even worldwide, or for a particular group like shorebirds.
Mm-hmm. And young birders get together. You were mentioning you went to a camp this summer?
Yes, there are many camps available for young birders and teenagers who are interested in birds across the country.
Mm-hmm. And you stay in touch with your friends that you've met through that?
Yes, we have our own group, various groups on Facebook.
Great. And how about what you learn? Obviously you learn about birds, but beyond birds, what kind of things do you feel are educational for young people about birding?
Well, so many birders are interested in other facets of the natural world. Like there are people who are interested in butterflies, dragonflies, reptiles, amphibians, mammals, so many other things. There are botanists among birders. And when you get outside and start looking for birds, you notice the other things. You notice the trees that the birds are in. You notice the caterpillar that the bird just ate. You notice the lemming that would provide food for that snowy owl. And you learn about all the interconnectedness of the world. Learn about ecosystems and habitats. And very much.
Yeah, I've noticed out birding, it really helps if you can say it's on the maple tree versus it's on the oak tree or whatever.
Exactly, yeah. And actually a well-known field guide author just came out with the Sibley Guide to Trees.
Oh, that's great, because Sibley is a famous bird book, right?
Yes.
We've got this Sibley's Field Guide to Birds. What about geography? Young people, can they learn geography through birding?
Yes, you learn biogeographic regions, which takes the different habitats and biomes and it teaches you the different areas. Because when you learn bird range, you'll notice that it's tied to various landmarks, landforms. So you learn geography and you learn migration routes and you learn how the birds use geography to their advantage and how geography can funnel birds into various locations.
Interesting. Yeah, when we went up to the place in the UP this spring and birds were waiting to cross, I mean, that's a whole geographic phenomena.
Yes, the point, Whitefish Point, is a peninsula onto Lake Superior, which is about 15 miles between the tip of the point in Canada. So birds are funneled up there, they're funneled to the tip, and then they wait to cross, or when conditions are right, they can cross to Canada and continue north.
A lot of people were up there. I guess they go every, do you go every year, you said?
Yes, it's a very popular place, and it's very good for birds.
And weather is another thing that birders need to know a lot about, right?
Yes. Birds obviously can't go inside their house when there's bad storms, and so learning about weather can teach you when to go out to see the most birds. So if birds have been migrating at night and all of a sudden a thunderstorm comes through, they'll be knocked down. They won't be able to fly. They'll have to drop down, and in the morning after that night, you can get a ton of birds in one area.
And that's called fallout?
Yes, when literally hundreds of thousands of birds land in a certain area, mostly owing to storms, it's called a fallout of birds.
Which they talked about, or there's a book called The Big Year and also the movie called The Big Year, and that was a big thing in that movie, was people rushing from all over the world for a fallout.
Mm-hmm.
And how about developing your auditory and visual attention skills?
Oh, definitely. You learn to spot the motion, which is a very crucial skill when you're looking for a 6-inch bird among full, dense maple foliage. And so you learn how to spot birds, and you also learn various cues and the different tones of bird coloration that can help you identify it.
The hardest part was definitely getting the color blue, because these were my color tones that I could have done, but they were too bright, so I penciled it in, colored it lightly with blue, and then erased it, and that got that pale powder blue.
And you can also, learning to listen while not listening is another important skill to learn. I've heard of a famous birder, Roger Tory Peterson, who really started bird watching and birding. He could talk in a conversation while paying attention to the crickets and pick out 5 different species of crickets in the background while also continuing the conversation.
Wow, that's quite a skill. Yeah, I've noticed that I see and hear things that I never would have before. Like a year ago, in fact, there was a quote that one of the birders in the listserv sent to me. She had made a comment. I had asked, why do you birders love birding so much? And she said, starting to become aware of birds is like discovering a new universe. It's all around you, free, incredibly wonder-provoking, and yet invisible to most people. Which I thought was kind of true, because before it was all invisible. I never noticed it.
Exactly. Before you noticed maybe 2 pigeons that happened to land in front of you, and later on, when you start paying attention, you notice that there are hundreds of pigeons around you.
Yeah.
And in addition to the pigeons, there are all the other hidden birds. Even the ones that seem like they have such colorful plumages that you could never miss them, you start to notice them.
Now, there's another aspect to birding that I would think a lot of young people would enjoy, which is the competitions. Tell us about that. There's, in here, obviously, the big year. They've got the big sit, the biggest day, big bees. What are all those?
So generally when we put big in front of something, we mean that we're trying to see as many species as we can. And normally the numbers don't count. It's just the number of species. And so in a big year, you try to see as many species as you can in a year. And in the case of the movie, it was for North America. All this is trying to see as many species in North America in a year as they could. For big sits, you sit down in one location. You stay within a radius, within a circle, in a designated radius, and you try to count as many birds as you can see or hear from that circle in a day. And in big days, they're like big sits, only you can go anywhere you can travel to, basically, or within a geographic range.
And big bees?
Big bees, BGBY, stand for big green big years, which take the principle of big year, except when you think about doing a big year, you're driving all over the place, you're flying, you're using up a lot of carbon fuel, and you're releasing a lot of CO2 into the atmosphere. And so because that would be detrimental to our bird life, because it is being detrimental to wildlife, a big green big year is all the birds you see or hear in a certain year without using any carbon fuels. So you can bike, you can walk, you can run, but and you can see all those birds. And they've gotten some pretty amazing species counts without any cars.
It takes dedication.
It does.
But I suppose you'd be really healthy after a
Yes.
big year, a big bee. Now, if you're not a competitive person, would there be an advantage to you to still write down what you've seen, create lists for yourself?
Definitely. A good record is of critical importance, whether it's for a scientific program like eBird, which is an online website that collects people from all over the world, their data of what birds they go out and see. And eBird has been revolutionary, created distribution maps that are real time, basically. You know that they're most recent. They're the most recent range maps, and you can track spreads and population fluctuations based on these people's observations.
Citizen science at its best, eh?
Exactly. And even for a personal record, even if you're not competitive, even if you don't keep track of what species you've seen, keeping a list, educate yourself on what's around you.
Help you remember too.
Help
I
you
think.
remember, definitely.
Cement it in your brain a little bit. I know that's helped me. What's a normal number to, like, for instance, what's your life list? Well, did we explain life list?
Well, a life list is all the species of birds that you've seen in your life. And so again, we sort them geographically. There are North American life lists, world life lists, Michigan life lists, Washtenaw County life lists.
Okay.
But
well, let's say your Michigan life list. What's that?
It's, I checked it a couple days ago. It's at about 290 species.
Wow. That's pretty good, because the Washtenaw County ornithologist Dee Armstrong, she gave us a list, and I counted about 300 of Michigan birds that are possible. I can't Something
remember
like
my
that.
own totals, but I believe eBird has between 300 and 400 species on their database that people have reported in Michigan.
Oh, really? That many? Wow. Huh. And then in the North America itself, I think it's more like, I found a number 675. Is that about right?
I've heard for breeding species, the number of birds that actually breed in North America, it's around 715 is what I've heard. So it varies between who you ask. And if you count birds that have strayed to North America, the vagrants, like European species that turned up once in 1930, you get closer to 900.
Oh my goodness. I hear there's a service you can pay to have them let you know when there's a rare bird.
Yes, the North American Rare Bird Alert was a telephone number that you used to be able to, you would pay and you would dial the number that they would give you, and it would let you know about any rare birds, any vagrants in your area.
I think they mentioned this in the book and the movie.
It's called the hotline.
What's amazing to me is that the bird sticks around long enough for these people to get on a plane and go to these places. I'm just amazed at that.
Well, there are some birds that are called one-day wonders. So it'll turn up in a location, people will go see it, and the next day it's gone. Nobody knows where it went. And there's some species.
Frustrating to
it's very
travel a long way to
frustrating.
get to it.
And there's some species that are more prone to doing this than others. And but then there are others that stay for months. Some that, like a recent case in Texas, some that breed with local birds. A tropical mockingbird, which was a first record, may have been an escaped cage bird. Nobody's quite certain where it came from. It actually bred with a northern mockingbird and created hybrid offspring.
That brings us to the question of trying to identify a bird. I mean, hybridizing is going to really complicate things. Let's not talk about that. But if you even just go by the feathers of a regular bird, you've got their age, their gender, whether or not they're molting, whether or not they're breeding, and all those things change. So what are other things that you can look at to try to identify what the bird is, aside from all those things that could be changing?
Aside from the plumage, which is variable, and it's pretty easy typically to learn the different plumages. Like this time of year, there are lots of warblers around that have molted and changed into their drab plumage. It's drab. So those are called the confusing fall warblers for obvious reasons. But once you get, it's pretty easy to learn those plumages, but they're also aided by other parts of the bird. The feathers don't make a bird, and so the general shape, it's called GIS, General Impression of Shape and Size, a military term that we use to describe the silhouette of the bird, how it's acting, how big it is, and that sort of creates an impression of the bird that is very, very identifiable.
Would that be like the difference between a hairy and a downy woodpecker? I remember you taught me that the length of the bill is contrasting with the body is smaller for the downy than for the hairy?
For the example of the hairy and downy woodpeckers, they're basically identical in terms of plumage, except that hairy is about twice the size, or maybe 1.5 times the size of downy. Downy's about that big, hairy's that big. But when you can't judge size, which is very hard to do in the field, the bill length is the best way. And of course bill length factors into the general impression, but hairy's bills are about the length of their head, while downy's are much shorter.
And then there's all these subtle nuances that you birders seem to just know so well. Like one day you were all very excited about a bird and you were all watching it, and I said, "What bird is it?" And I can't remember what it was, but it didn't seem to be terribly unusual. And I said, "Well, you know, why is that so exciting?" And you said, "Because it's so high in the tree." And apparently you all knew that it usually stayed like midline in the tree instead of way at the top, which I thought was amazing that a bird would be so specific in its habitat.
When you go out and you do a lot of this, if you keep detailed notes, I mean, not really detailed, you don't need to keep track of what was the tail feather coloration of this robin, but when you keep good notes, then you sort of learn what the bird does. I wouldn't expect to go looking for a sparrow, which feeds on the ground, at the top of a tree. And so even subtler than that, when you see the different behaviors, it's unusual.
Like there was a bird I thought was a kingbird. That's a kingbird behind us, and I had shown it to you and you said, "Oh no, that's a phoebe." And you said, "See the tail wag," because the phoebes wag their tails and the kingbirds don't.
Behavior is very important.
And flight rhythms, like the goldfinch, I know because it goes like this.
I've heard it says potato chip and flies with a dip.
It chips. Yeah, speaking of vocalizations, let's talk about that. What are some of the different kinds of noises that birds make?
Well, there are two general categories, songs and calls. And so songs are the pretty ones. They're generally long, they're used to attract a mate or just to stake out a territory, and they're generally used only on the breeding season. So when you hear that cardinal waking you up at 4 a.m. in the summertime, that's a song.
They're pretty complex, some of those songs, and I remember we were at McGee Marsh and one of the guides helped us. He was talking about the difference between the Nashville and the Tennessee warbler by the patterns. Let's show that clip now.
The Tennessee and the Nashville warblers both have very similar songs. The Tennessee warbler, since Tennessee is 3 syllables, it's like ten na 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 see 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 see. The Nashville warbler, like Nashville, Tennessee, Nashville only has 2 syllables. So I think of the Nashville acting like it's trying to be a Tennessee warbler, but then it laughs at you. So they're like, Nash, 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 blah, 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 blah. Nashville, Tennessee. Nashville, 2 syllables, 2-parted song. Tennessee, 3 syllables, 3-parted song.
And then the second one is more subtle. It's the calls. It's the general, what they use to sort of keep in touch with each other. And they can range from, there's some very short calls that birds use at night when they're migrating that are like 1/25th of a second. Very short. You have to, in order to tell what it is, you have to look at it on a spectrogram, on a sonogram.
Oh.
And from that signature you can tell what it is, but you can't tell it by ear. But then there are longer calls. But most of the time they're just little chips, or there may be a chirp. Those are the little more subtle calls.
So tell us some of the other tips that you can use to try to figure out birds, like the listservs. I know that there's a lot of activity on the internet.
Yeah, so there are many different places you can go to get help if you need to identify a bird. And sometimes a description, a textual description will be enough, and other times we may need a photograph to really help, or a recording of the song that you're having trouble with, because a picture is worth 1,000 words. But when you want to identify a bird, there are online forums like the ones that Whatbird hosts, where people.
What's it called?
Whatbird. Like, what bird is that?
Oh, okay.
And it's an online bird ID site, sort of an online field guide, and they also have a forum where you can post questions. And you can also look up your local listserv, which is an email group for birders in your area. And some listservs are restricted to bird sightings. A lot are actually chat groups where you can talk about the moths maybe that you saw, or you can talk about the birds and you can ask questions as well.
I think it would be helpful to be good with a camera, because then you can send in your picture and say, what is this?
There are quite a few photographers turn birders, birders turn photographers. And even with a small little, your family point and shoot, you can take pictures. While other birders invest in giant lenses.
And I've noticed they're very nice about, well, I guess I'm not talking about the cameras so much as the scopes, but when I've been out on bird hikes, they'll be very generous about allowing you to look through their scope, which is really nice.
Spotting scopes are sort of the more high-powered binoculars. They're better for distant birds. But the other thing is, because they're so high-powered, they need to be stabilized, and the tripod stabilizes it and holds it in place. And that makes it very easy to share bird sightings through a scope.
But we should say that you don't have to have a real expensive binoculars, because I've got mine here. They were about $120, and I have been just so amazed at how great the birds look through this. I mean, it's just way, way different than the binoculars that I had, 5 years ago.
A good pair of binoculars makes a huge difference. And I mean, well, you can use those $5 Kmart pairs, or $5 is pretty cheap.
Yeah.
Well, you can use those pairs. You won't get a good image. You'll have a harder time. It'll be frustrating. And especially they can break very easily. They're not durable. And the bottom line for a good pair of binoculars is about $100. But even those $100 pairs will last many years. And those ones, Nikon is a very good brand. Leopold makes hunting optics, also a very good brand. Bushnell. Those are all very not cheap, but very low end, but high quality optics.
And let's talk about the economic benefits of birding for instance, the state of Michigan. Let me just read this quote that I came across. It says, a recent U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service report found that 48 million people engaged in birding in 2006, generating $82 million, sustaining 700,000 jobs, and creating $11 billion in local, state, and federal tax revenues. That's nationally, but Michigan, too, I hear, is this fantastic state for birding. There's so many sites.
Yeah, there are lots of amazing places. And at certain times of the year, these can be the best places in the Midwest for various types of birds. For instance, currently, in the early fall time, shorebird migration, the sandpipers and plovers, the little birds that love mudflats. Because we tend to be a bit more inland, most of the shorebirds around in the inland areas of Michigan go for mudflats. But on the shoreline, there's some truly spectacular places for shorebird migration.
Well, we're really lucky. We've got Whitefish Point up north. We've got the Kirtland warbler, the rarest songbird in North America, I've heard. I mean, it's great. So we should tell people quickly what are a couple websites they can go to for more information.
Well, definitely the American Birding Association,
Okay.
which has sponsored me on many trips.
Great.
And it's been a huge help. It's a national organization for birders.
ABA.org.
And then for more local, the Washtenaw Audubon Society is a local networking for birders and beginning bird watchers.
WashtenaWAudubon.org. Great. Well, thank you, Sarah, so much for coming today. It's
Thank
been
you
really
so much.
interesting. You'll find links relevant to the show at ewashtenaw.org/greenroom. Thanks for joining us here in the Green Room.